This is the lecture for Part 2, Global Terrorism, Chapter 3, the United States of America, and Chapter 4, Canada and the Caribbean. I am Professor Bill Perkins from Atlantic Cape Community College, and the information taken for this lecture comes from the textbook Terrorism Today, The Past, the Players, the Future, 5th edition. So terrorism, as defined by the FBI, the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. I'm going to leave that up there so you can take notes. Okay, connecting the dots, or rather this image depicts the dots that should have been connected. It all correlates with terrorist activity. It took place here in the United States and abroad. Covers the World Trade Center 1993 bombing we just spoke about. Oklahoma City bombing, September 11th, 2001. U.S. Embassy attacks in 1998. Suicide bomber in USS Cole in Yemen. So dot 1 is the World Trade Center car bombing. In 1993, it was the first strike on U.S. soil. A car bomb exploded under the World Trade Center in New York City. So the World Trade Center car bombing took place February 26, 1993 at 12:18 p.m. The device used was an IED. It was placed in a rental vehicle rented from a Ryder rental in Jersey City. It was parked in the second level of the basement parking. And the blast produced a crater approximately 150 feet in diameter and 5 floors deep. It killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000 others. Approximately 6,800 tons of concrete and steel were displaced by the blast. It was identified that the main explosive charge consisted of approximately 1,200 to 1,500 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer base explosive and urea nitrate. It was later learned that it was planned by a group of terrorists, including Ramzi Yalsef, Mahmoud Abouima, Mohammed Salama, Nidal Ayad, Abdul Rahman Yassin, and Ahmed Ajad. And it was financed through Khalid Mohammed, who was also a principal architect in 9/11. Pretty persistent with the World Trade Center. And this is dot 2, the Oklahoma City bombing. We're not going to play the video. That was accomplished in class, and feel free to visit the Blackboard where we have the posted videos if you want to review it again. So the Oklahoma City bombing, April 1995, Pentagon study revealed the destruction was caused by more than one bomb. Further study concluded destruction was caused by 5 bombs. So you had 168 people dead and more than 500 injured. Initial reports suspected that the suspect was of Middle Eastern descent, and it resulted in prejudice and public anger. Further investigation revealed Timothy McVeigh and his accomplice Terry Nichols were actually the perpetrators. Both were members of a right-wing militia, and U.S. law enforcement agencies had to reevaluate policies and procedures regarding domestic terrorism. And it made us think, where do the real threats lie? After the 1993 car bomb in the World Trade Center and causing all that destruction, right away people thought this is 2 years later, it had to be another attack from the Middle East, and here it ended up being an act of domestic terrorism, so the threats had to be re-evaluated. And here we have the main perpetrator, Timothy McVeigh. It It was the most vicious attack by an American on fellow Americans, and he was a member of the PATRIOT movement militia, and it developed in the early 1990s, and that it fosters true American ideals encompassing individualism, armed citizens, and minimum interference with government, much like a lot of the militias. Um, he too rented a Ryder rental truck. Um, the truck was packed with ammonium nitrate, fuel oil, and topics at high explosive. The attack was unpredicted in vulnerability assessments, which probably weren't very comprehensive back then considering the threats. Um, Motivation, along with other forms of domestic terrorism, could have been consequent to the ATF raid on the Waco compound, which I believe was a year prior. And here we have the diligent patrolman or highway patrolman who arrested Timothy McVeigh, and it was just off of a motor vehicle stop, consequent to Timothy McVeigh not having a rear license plate on his bumper. So here we have dot 3 in our game of connected dots. In 1998, U.S. embassies targeted in Africa. So August 7th, 1998, at approximately 10:30, between 10:30 and 10:40 actually, two simultaneous explosions rocked two embassies in East Africa. And they were committed by Ahmed Khalfan Gelani. Ahmed Khalfan Gelani. And he ended up being sentenced to life in prison on January 25th, 2011, identified as an Al Qaeda operative and a Tanzanian national, and he conspired with Osama bin Laden when orchestrating this. And I just want to specify that that's exactly his role. He was the main architect and orchestrator of these events because both bombings were committed by suicide bombers. So obviously the actors were not around to be charged and convicted. And the targeted embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and chosen weapons were, of course, car bombs. Killed 224 total, including 12 Americans. So the Kenyan bombing blast was strategically positioned at a bank. Um, I guess in the architecture of this operation, it was identified that the embassies were in fact constructed with uh, blast-proof construction material, and the bank, by destroying the bank, it would cause secondary destruction through the fallout on the embassy, and it was strategically planned to take place at that time, consequent to a meeting between Ambassador Prudence Bushnell and the Kenyan Trade Minister. So the Tanzania bombing, and this took place in front of the embassy, and it left a large crater outside the embassy there, strategically placed at a spot where a gasoline truck was parked and remained. And here we have dot 4, the suicide bombing of the USS Cole. It was carried out by, obviously, suicide bombers. It killed 17 U.S. sailors. We spoke about this in chapters 1 and 2. And we had mentioned and had images of the sailors, the victims. It was facilitated by a small inflatable carrying explosives. It was rammed into the port side of the ship above the waterline. It's not the first attack like this. January 3rd, 2000, there was a failed attempt. The explosives were too heavy and the inflatable capsized. So here we have dot 5, December 25th, Christmas, 2009, the underwear bomber. And it's a good thing this mission did not carry out. It was not affected correctly. We had some malfunctions. So you had Abdul you're going to have to forgive me for the name, Abdul Muttalib, above. He flew from Nigeria to the U.S. via the Netherlands, and at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, he transferred to a Detroit-bound flight. So here, strapped to his leg, was 80 grams of explosive powder made from a mixture of PETN, and it's a high explosive. And 40 minutes from landing, he tried to ignite the explosive powder by injecting it with acid. So here he had a syringe on him containing acid, and the only thing that happened really was a bang and flames burned his leg, but the bomb failed to detonate. So again, we're going to connect those dots. So we have dot 1, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. It was the first attack like that on American soil, and it wasn't followed up with a collaborative effort. In other words, there weren't additional attacks like 9/11, and it was newsworthy. However, it didn't create the needed sense of urgency. It wasn't covered like how we have events now. The news will spend days and days talking about one or covering one event. This here got minimal coverage. That's why many of you are hearing about it for the first time in this class. Dot 2, we have the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. And here it was domestic terrorism. And because of the 1993 World Trade Center attack, it was believed to be carried out by somebody of Middle Eastern descent. So when it was learned it was not, and it was carried out by a domestic terrorist, the heightened suspicion associated with the Middle East diminished, which actually worked against us. We were kind of putting our eggs all in one basket when it came down to vulnerability assessments and, looking at the, heightening the suspicion on various terrorist groups, whether they're groups from Middle East or domestic. It just seemed like our concentration went to domestic. And consequent to this, everybody was being really careful of profiling the wrong individuals on subsequent attacks because of the fallout from the Oklahoma City bombing. So, and then you had a lack of urgency for increased intel programs left the door open for dots 3, 4, and 5. Here, this was during the time where we had cut spending in intel and military. And as you'll see after September 11th, we really didn't have a well-identified infrastructure for anti-terrorism. So who could be a domestic terrorist? Maybe these guys? The popular stereotype of the American domestic terrorist includes the following buzzwords: stupid, uneducated, southern or hillbilly, right-wing, or gun nut. It's actually far from the truth. And here we have to be careful of stereotyping, because in this instance, this stereotype, after the Centennial Olympic Park bombing in 1996, the FBI wrongly identified Richard Jewell as the likely perpetrator, when in fact, Jewell did fit the stereotype everybody was looking for, but Eric Rudolph, who's pictured below him, was actually charged with the bombing. And I believe Richard Jewell was able to sue and won a large settlement as a result. So here we have domestic terrorism as defined by the FBI, and involves groups or individuals who are based and operate entirely within the United States and Puerto Rico, without foreign direction, and whose violent acts are directed at elements of the United States government or population. I'll leave that there for a second. So, domestic terrorism can be categorized as follows: revolutionary nationalist groups, extreme right-wing ideological groups like the KKK. FBI has identified an increase in activities, and extreme left-wing ideological groups like the Weather Underground kind of no longer exist. And the FBI has identified a decrease in activities. And if you remember in the lecture, I explained why. The cultural changes here experienced in the United States kind of increased, the anger and the the feel of the need from those right-wing groups to advocate their points and with the cultural changes clearly have been working in favor for the left-wingers, so there's been lack of that sense of urgency to advocate their points. So, the right-wingers, here we have a black president now, a very diverse culture in our country. Diversity is accepted and embraced now. Um, you just have an evolution of diversity, which has kind of touched and has, I guess, adversely affected, if you will, the ideological foundations of the right wingers. So they've had a lot more, I guess, to complain about. Also, encompassing the direct domestic terrorism or foreign groups operating in the United States. I also went over many of these, explained a little bit about West Paterson, New Jersey, Dearborn, Michigan. I believe there's groups out of Buffalo, New York as well, and all these can be linked to terrorism, Islamism, jihadism, extreme Islamic activity over in the Middle East. So, and here the groups are actually operating in the United States. Many of them could be U.S. citizens. Um, and you also have the religious extremist groups. So, domestic terrorism derives from hate groups. Now, currently there are an estimated 926 hate groups active in the United States. Ku Klux Klan, 186 associated groups. Neo-Nazi, 196 associated groups. White nationalists, 111 associated groups. Racist skinhead, 98 associated groups. Christian identity, 39 associated groups. Neo-Confederate, 93 associated groups. Black separatists, 113 associated groups. And general hate groups, these are the ones, I guess, that just hate everything. And there's 90 associated groups in them. So, what is the difference between hate groups and militias? Well, first, militias tend to attract those whose focus is political in nature. Hate groups tend to attract members who share hatred towards individuals/groups who or that can be categorized by race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or ethnicity/national origin. So what's interesting is when you look at the definition of a hate crime, it kind of correlates with the old hate groups. So I guess their associated behavior does many times fall consistent with those of criminal acts. So we're going to reattack the PATRIOT Act, and the U.S. needed provisions to deal with a line drawn between hateful speech and inciting violence, and between a militia group and a terrorist organization. Now, keep in mind that most states' administrative codes and statutes permit militias. In fact, that's how our country revolted against the English and Great Britain, England, back in the Revolutionary War, and we fought with militias. Militias were also very prominent in the Civil War. So it is permissible to have a state militia. And here, the PATRIOT Act allows U.S. law enforcement agencies / officers significant leeway in dealing with terrorist investigations. It takes the activities associated with hate groups and militias and associates the word terrorism with said activities, thereby enhancing the empowerment of law enforcement agencies to investigate the crime or act as a terrorist act. All right, when I was showing the behavior associated with the hate groups by articulating what a hate crime was, if you took all the elements out of that definition, and same thing with the state statutes. Um, if you basically what the Patriot Act does is it takes that associated behavior, and if you label it as possible terrorism or possible terrorist activity, it then gives great empowerment for U.S. law enforcement and agencies to start wiretapping, doing things that I guess would be normally, I guess, bending search and seizure laws um, if they were just looked at as a hate crime or a crime. So here we had the left wing and the right wing groups. Spoke about this a little bit already, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit more. Left wing. What drove it was the failure of communism and the fall of the former Soviet Union in 1989 deprived many leftist groups of a coherent ideology or tangible support. So the membership in extreme left-wing groups has won considerably, and we went over why. They have a lot less to be upset about nowadays with the evolution of diversity, and more things are accepted nowadays. And the right-wingers usually adhere to anti-government or racist ideology. They attract followers who feel disenfranchised by rapid changes in the U.S. culture and seek personal affirmation. And these are the people that want to cling on to somebody else who has the same hate, and they want to belong to somebody. They want to belong to a group. They want to belong to that militia. You know. So, and they've increased considerably, and that's, kind of the reverse effect of that cultural change and what's accepted. I spoke about with the left wingers. And here we have domestic left-wing terrorist groups. They're anti-capitalists. You'll hear a lot of Marxism, anti-imperialism, anti-militarism, anti-Christian, pro-socialist, pro-black liberation, pro-communist, anti-Semitic. And here we have an example, Weather Underground. And you don't hear anything about the Weather Underground anymore. Formed during the 1960s, during the times of the Vietnam War, and movements that challenged the respect of norms and values. Peace, love, war. They originally formed as a splinter group, meaning peaceful protests were ineffective. They identified that violence drives the need of change. They're going to drive it in you with violence. March 1970, the leader, Bernardine Dorn, declared war against the U.S. government. Days later, 3 weathermen were killed when one of their bombs accidentally detonated in their basement apartment in Manhattan. And the bomb was intended for a dance at a military base. Again, they're anti-military. So they thought they would get their point across. They were strong sympathizers with the Black Panthers, another left-wing group. They were targeted by the FBI and ultimately resulted in the group's demise in the 1980s. Here we have the Black Panther Party, and we have the new Black Panther Party now. Rebirth happened in the 1990s, took on the name of the original Black Panther Party, probably saved a lot in business cards, formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in 1966. They're militant black nationalism with Marxism ideologies. Economic and socio-political injury fuel the rage. Stratification causes conflict. They do not like social stratification. And here we have the Nation of Islam. It's been around since the 1930s. Became prominent with figures such as spokesmen like Malcolm X, and now it's headed by spokesman Louis Farrakhan. Radical, but nowhere near what we see in Islamism. Uh, it could be a venue. Right now it's really not. They foster the ideologies associated with their religion of Islam, but as far as being extreme, not as dangerous as what we're seeing in the Middle East. Nevertheless, it can provide a platform for them, and it's important just to acknowledge that. And here's an example from Louis Farrakhan. They call them Hezbollah, terrorists. I call them freedom fighters. No one asks why they would do such a thing. Why would they do such a thing? What has driven them to this point? That's what the UN, the US, and Europe doesn't want to deal with because the Zionists have control in England, Europe, in the United States, and around the world. And the Zionists he's referring to are the Jews. So that was Minister Louis Farrakhan's speech at the District Council, 33 Union Hall, Philadelphia, PA, in 1996. So we touched on the domestic right-wing groups. You just want to remember these things. Take note, both groups seem to be anti-Semitic. And the extreme right-wingers are Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, black separatists. And here we saw the Cutery militia. We saw the video. Very well orchestrated. I think I pointed out in class how you can tell many of the members apparently had military tactical training. Domestic right-wing terrorist group, Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee. Membership in the thousands. Locations primarily in the southeast. Criminal activity, arson, bombings, murders, and assaults. Here's the skinhead culture. Consider themselves to be working class, anarchy-oriented, divided into three very distinct groups: trads, boneheads, sharps. Back to the militia. You want to know the FBI description of a militia. A militia is a domestic organization with two or more members. The organization must possess and use firearms, and the organization must conduct or encourage paramilitary training. Here's the Southern Poverty Law Center. I explained this in class. Like I said in the beginning, actually first day of class, I had mentioned that much of how terrorism is viewed when people go to categorize or label it, it's very subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder. So here you have the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they're an American nonprofit civil rights organization noted for legal victories against white supremacist groups. They provide legal representation for victims of hate groups. It provides classification lists on hate groups, actually provided to the FBI for UCR data and other statistics based on mutable characteristics. And they tend to focus on right-wing hate groups. As a result, in scrutinizing accusations by the right-wingers, saying it labeled as this group here gets labeled by the right-wingers as a passive-aggressive style left-winger. Basically, what the right-wingers saying is that the group's comprised of left-wingers and they're no different than any other hate group. They'll come out with adverse media against right-wingers, and although it's not a physical or an extreme attack like a sniper would be, a bombing would be, any thing that's going to cross over into an aggravated crime. Uh, Nevertheless, what the right wingers are saying is that It's the attack on personal character of some of the right-wing politicians. Makes it no different than any other hate group. And here we have radical Islam. We have Osama bin Laden announces fatwa in an Arabic newspaper in London in 1998, stated that the United States had declared war against God and his messenger. It called for the killing of Americans anywhere on earth as being a sacred duty of all Muslims. So, we're going to examine the birth of Al Qaeda. How did all this come about? Well, Osama bin Laden went to Afghanistan and waged jihad, yes, there's that word again, against the Soviets. So bin Laden was the son of a wealthy Saudi construction. His father was into construction, and he accepted millions of U.S. dollars in aid when he was battling the Soviets. The Soviets ultimately left in 1988, and then he was stuck with this quandary of what to do next. So bin Laden kept operations running at the base. So hence the base, Al Qaeda, is the literal translation for the base, Al Qaeda. So after war with the Soviets, the group developed and organized long corporate structures. So this was very well organized group. Al Qaeda became almost like a country, its own country. Possessed working departments involving media relations, arms procurement, and intelligence gathering. They had, tried to have a well-organized military for defense. And like every other leader, Osama bin Laden needed a right-hand man. So we're going to meet the godfather of jihad, Abdullah Yusuf Azam. And he is the central figure of global development of the militant Islamist movement. So, like I said, this globalization that they participated in, um, it's doing multiple things, especially here in the United States. One, it added a whole nother dynamic, a whole nother group of domestic terrorists because now some of these people are natural born citizens now. Some of the people, adhering to what Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azam had, wanted them to carry out. So they're embracing the ideologies of Islamism and extreme Islam, jihad, and they're right here in the United States. So those are the dynamics, and then also too, when I had covered in chapter one the excerpts out of the Quran, um, how many of the extreme Islamists is interpreting those excerpts as defending their holy land. Well, they're considering the entire world now their holy land. So the Western civilization is how they're perceiving it. We're the ones, or when I say we, being an American, we as Westerners are infringing on their holy land because they've kind of labeled the world their holy land now. So he built a scholarly, ideological, and practical parliamentary infrastructure. So they had government, and he envisioned a pan-Islamic transnational movement that would transcend the political map of the Middle East drawn by non-Islamic colonial powers. And that's it. That's exactly what I was touching on. That line, the Islamic line, he was expanding out, and the Western nations, the Western culture was now going to become Islamic. And he was killed in a car bomb attack in Pakistan in 1989. So apparently somebody wasn't adhering or didn't embrace his ideologies. So here we have September 11th, and we're going to cover the operation itself. The plot was developed by Osama bin Laden, a shot to the U.S., but think of the significance of the World Trade Center. So it was on our soil, but if you think of the symbology, what the World Trade Center stood for, what was it about? You had multiple cultures countries operating out of there. It embodied and it was the epitome of us as a melting pot and many Western cultures, and that was Osama bin Laden's way to send us a message. So, for the attackers, Germany was a major launching pad for four of the primary members of the plot. It was well orchestrated. They did vulnerability assessments, they did intelligence gathering, and the mission deployment was almost spot on. So the recruits were well versed in Western culture and well trained. Al Qaeda possessed the means and infrastructure for the training. They actually went to terrorist camps, terrorist training, military style training, and then they went through flight school here in the United States. So the suspects themselves, they were between 20 and 28 years old. Most of them were unemployed. Most had little more than a high school education. Most were probably unmarried. You see, what I was discussing in chapter 1 and 2 about the recruiting process, they go for very unassuming individuals, unremarkable. So, four came from a cluster of towns in an isolated and underdeveloped region of Saudi Arabia. All were Al Qaeda trained in Afghanistan and all made the trip to the U.S. without hindrance. So they got through customs and immigration processes, and they were able to rehearse the missions and administer reconnaissance missions, meaning that some of them went through practice flights, and others actually went and tested airport security and documented certain behaviors and response times from airport security personnel. So, following the attacks, there was an outcry as to where to direct the response. Um, Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, and Al Qaeda came to the forefront of the targets. Now, remember, there was over 2,600 people who died in the World Trade Center attacks, and that's not even encompassing the 200 and some odd individuals who were actually on the flights themselves. So this was even larger than Pearl Harbor. So the U.S. collaborative work efforts with Pakistan were to, because we brought Pakistan in on our collaborative effort, and we had told them, stop Al Qaeda operatives at its border, and you got to end the logistical support to Al Qaeda. Now, Pakistan was an ally of ours, and they wanted to remain allies, but if we remember how we even found Osama bin Laden, where we found him, what government was harboring him, it was actually Pakistan. So it's one of those keep your enemies close and your friends, keep your enemies closer, keep your friends close, enemies closer. So stop Al Qaeda operatives at its border was what we gave them the order to. We also wanted to give them U.S. blanket overflight and landing rights for all necessary military and intelligence operations. We wanted to provide territorial access to the U.S. and coalition engaged in operations against Al Qaeda. If you remember, that started almost immediately. We wanted them also to provide us, the United States, intelligence and publicly condemn the terrorist attacks. We wanted Pakistan on board, and we wanted them to condemn the attacks as a kind of a symbol of them being on board. And we wanted them to cut off recruits, personnel, and supplies to the Taliban. So the aftermath. So following the attacks, it was identified the intel community knew Osama bin Laden posed a threat. Like I told many of you, Osama bin Laden was mentioned in, back in the Iran-Contra, the arms scandal. He had been around a while, and he's been a threat for a while. The reason why we weren't so on to him around this time is because they were just coming off of battling the Soviets, and at one time, I'm not going to say he was one of our allies, but we had him as in an allied position for a reason because he was battling the Soviets. So here, the intel community knew that he posed a threat. FBI field office in Florida knew of the individuals in the pilot training. Um, in 2001, passenger screening was also a low-paying job and very menial. Security could not attract the best recruits. Therefore, they had, I say the terrorists pretty much had carte blanche at the airport. There was no cross-functional team or intelligence sharing in place to connect the dots, which would change later with the U.S. PATRIOT Act in 2001. So here we're going to fast forward to 2007, May 8th, Fort Dix 6. The 6 men planned to fire rocket-propelled grenades at Humvees at Fort Dix and light the whole place up. So you had 6 conspirators, 4 ethnic Albanians from the former Yugoslavia, 1 Turkish immigrant, 1 U.S. citizen from Jordan, and 6 of the plots since 9/11 targeted military personnel or military facilities in the United States. And you can watch the video on the blackboard. And here you have Faisal Shahzad, and he attempted to detonate an IED in Times Square, May 1st, 2010. Now, what thwarted this attack was the bomb, as you'll see depicted in the image, actually did ignite, but they just didn't go off. And it was actually 2 food vendors who noticed the car bomb and notified police. Some very lucky people in the area that day. Okay, we're moving on into, most of that was covered in Chapter 3. Moving on into Chapter 4, just going to cover a couple different groups here. In Canada, you have the FLQ, they're extreme separatist group, active in Quebec. And they seek a sovereign French-speaking independent state within Canada. 1963, they sought separation from English-speaking Canada. They're a left-wing organization that espoused a workers' revolution. More than 200 bombings between 1963 and 1970. Quite a bit. And again, you can see the video on the blackboard. So you have the Mashateros. They're a quasi-terrorist organization. Many know them also too from the biker organization, bike club, bike gang basically. They blew up 11 jet fighters belonging to the Puerto Rico National Guard. Pretty active in Puerto Rico, mostly into drugs and weapons smuggling. So just make a note of them. And that concludes our lecture for chapters 3 and 4. And that'll be it.